Afternoon, everyone, and respecting everyone's time, we're going to go ahead and call this meeting of the MFP Task Force to order. Roll call, please, sir.
Mr. Birkin,
Here.
Dr. Brumley, Ms. Champagne, Mr. Claxton, Ms. Conaway, Dr. Corville, Mr. David, Senator Edmonds, Mr. Irwin, Mr. Harris.
Here. I'm his proxy.
Who for who?
Mr. Irwin. Here.
Okay. Ms. Hughes, Mr. Hollis, Dr. Kingham, Ms. LaFleur, Ms. Johnson, proxy for Dr. Mills, Mr. Morris, Ms. Gillibalt, proxy for Dr. Polito, Dr. Pope, Mr. Baker, proxy for Ms. Posey,
Here.
Dr. Procopio, Ms. Romer, Representative Schlegel, Ms. Shirai, Dr. Walker, Dr. Baker,
Here.
Mr. Bujold, Dr. Riley, Mr. Roche, proxy for Ms. Whitney.
Karen Trish, the new executive director for LAP instead of Joe David. My name's on the list, but Joe David was called.
My apologies, I have you in attendance.
No, no. Any other proxies or appointees?
You counting them up, Aaron? Do we have a quorum?
Yes, sir, we have a quorum.
Okay, great.
Sorry, my math was a little slow this afternoon.
Okay, so we'll move, next item, sir.
Consideration of an overview of programs within MFP formula funding levels 1 and 2.
So we need a motion to. Motion, please. Ms. Champagne. Mr. Harris, second. Okay. Ms. Shono, it's all yours.
Good afternoon, Beth Siano with the Department of Ed, here to talk about levels 1 and 2 of the MFP formula. We're going to start with level 1. And level 1 is really the reason, it is the main component of the formula. It is the reason why back in the late 80s that the Bessie board and the legislature came to conclusions that we needed to shift from a resource-driven formula to a student-driven formula. It actually calculates the equitable distribution of state funds, and over 2/3 of the current funding that we dedicate to MFP is actually driven by level 1. There are two calculations to achieve the purpose of equitable distributions, and that includes a cost calculation where we actually look at factors to determine what a projected cost of education in Louisiana might be, and then we actually share that cost between the state and locals because the Constitution requires that this cost be shared between the state and the local school systems. The first thing we do, being it's a student-driven formula, is we have a base student count. At the time that the formula was developed back in the early 90s, it was the first time that students had actually been counted. Before that, there were reports, manual reports, hard copy reports that were submitted to the department that did most of the projections as to how the money was divided, but a student count was determined at the time by the finance experts that helped Louisiana to be the base where we would start that cost calculation. And so there are 44 other states in the nation who continue to use a similar count. We use a single day count, which is February 1 currently. And each student in that base count is 1. It's counted as a 1 in the math calculation. Base count, the membership definition allows for students in grades K through 12 to be counted, as well as those special education infants that are ages birth to 2, plus preschool students ages 3 to 5, the special education, and students until the age of 21 years. You'll notice that pre-K is not included because pre-K is not funded within, not named specifically to be funded within the minimum foundation program. So pre-K students are the ones that are not included in the formula. So we have a base count of all the students that are enrolled and actively attending on that February 1 date, but we also have an appreciation for students that have special characteristics that actually require a little more cost to educate. Those weights were designed through many studies by our finance experts over the years to determine what was a reasonable valuation to put on these weights for each of the categories that Louisiana values and recognizes as needing extra funds. There are 5 different categories. First, we have the economically disadvantaged weight at 22%. So that means that I'm a student, I count as 1, and if I meet any of the criteria for economically disadvantaged student, I count as 1.22% in the math calculation. Currently, we use lots of data sets that we are able to have access to through other agencies, as well as data that we collect on our own. And those include the Medicaid qualifying students, those that qualify for TANF through the Department of Children and Family Services, for SNAP, for the McKinney Homeless Program, the English language learner, if they happen to be an English language learner classified as such, and then the reduced price lunch eligibility. We merge all that data, all the data, which we actually are fortunate to be able to just retrieve from these other agencies, and we merge all that together in order to make the economically disadvantaged count. There are 44 other states that currently utilize a weight to recognize the extra costs with economically disadvantaged students, and 48 other states recognize the extra costs associated with educating English language learners specifically. So similar to us, they have a component in their formula where they value and measure and include that in their calculations. This 22%, you might be curious, has been in effect since 08-09, when Dr. Augenblick, the state's school finance expert, came in and worked extensively with Bessie and the department with regards to determining whether or not this was an appropriate percentage to actually utilize in the formula. There was some national research that they did through his firm, at the time there were 14 other states that used a very similar amount of the weight. Since that time, we have revisited the topic a couple of times, but have confirmed, because of looking nationally still, that that is an appropriate amount to value an economically disadvantaged student. Career and technical education weight is at 6%. So this weight has been in the formula for since the very beginning, and it is intended to support those costs associated with career and technical education courses whose supplies may cost a large amount, more so than just a regular ed classroom. So this would be the supplies in a welding shop or anything nowadays creatively with technology or something that was needed in a career type course. that is what this is designed to identify as an extra cost. So we use this not on students, it has a component of students, but we actually look at the units. So if for every student, if they take 3 career courses, we consider that to be a unit. So that student actually has 3 different counts in the data that we put into the formula. So it is units tied to students, it's just not as a direct count of students like we do so far in the base and the economically disadvantaged. The last count of those career and technical education counts, what we're using right now in the formula is about 317,000 units that we actually consider as the starting point that goes into the formula, and then we apply that weight to it. So that it has trended around that number, growing some. In 23-24, we were using the count of about 14,000. So it is increasing over the last couple of years. The next weight we have is the students with disabilities weight, which is at 150%. That means if I'm a student, I've already been counted as 1 in the base, but if I'm a special ed student, I get counted another 1.2. That was designed, again, by our school finance experts. The philosophy at the time that the formula, this weight was designed, was that this was a block grant, and the whole Level 1 money is supposed to be a block grant to the student, to the school systems, because Bessie and the legislature at that time decided that the decisions on things like this, on the expenditure of these dollars, needed to be made as close to the student as possible. So the money, particularly with students with disabilities, goes out as a block grant. We have over the years studied perhaps maybe doing the student with disabilities weight a little differently, but each time it's been studied, it's been reaffirmed that this is the way that is best for the students to be funded. Right now, we are funding the last count, which is last February, which we're using in the formula for this year, at about almost 94,000 students that we count. We've seen a huge jump in the number of students with disabilities go up between 2-1 of 23 to 2-1 24. That was a jump of well over 3,000 students. And looking as to why this might have occurred, it was determined that this might have been some catch up from the pandemic, where families came back into public education. Their students were identified as special education, and the school systems were catching up on all of the evals and things that they needed in order to identify this student as a special ed student. From some preliminary data from this October 1 count that is just closed, we're just kind of analyzing the data right now. It does appear we're on a trend upward again, so I am expecting, or predicting, I guess, that February 1 will have another big jump. And this adds a tremendous amount of cost to the formula at the value of this weight. But it looks like we're serving a lot more kids in our populations from the statistics that we see right now. Gifted and talented. In Louisiana, we identify gifted and talented students as needing have additional cost in their education as well. We have 37 other states that do the same as us, as identify this as a cost that they consider to be additional on top of just a base cost. They're counted just like the students with disabilities. There's paperwork and things through the evaluations that need to be on file in order for them to be reported to us. And you'll know that particularly these students, these are all, not all, but there are audits done through all of the data inputs for the minimum foundation program formula. That requirement was put in the statute in the early 90s that said there shall be an audit of the MFP data. And so on an annual basis, any of these inputs into the formula, we do have audits that are done. We do these exception reports and analyze statistics to identify, pockets of students that we need to actually look at. And the team actually, we do look at the documentation to substantiate that they qualified for these counts. The gifted and talented count right now that we're funding in the formula this year is about a little over 26,000 students. In the prior year, we funded about 25,000, so it is a much smaller jump in the students that are being identified as gifted and talented versus those that are in the students with disabilities weight. The economy of scale weight is the last weight, and it doesn't have to have its own student count because we actually use the base student count to supply the data needed for the economy of scale weight. But it was designed from the very beginning of the formula, and it is to identify those city impaired school systems who actually have less than 7,500 students. At the time, 7,500 students was considered small, and the weight was designed to recognize those costs associated when you have fixed costs in those small areas that you have to, add into the cost that you must pay. And it was recognized that some consideration had to be done. So what this weight does is the closer you are to the 7,500 means you're not as small, so you get a very small percentage of this weight because it's curvilinear, which means it goes from like 0 to 20%. The further away you get from the 7,500, so we now have districts at below 1,000 students, they're getting a greater percentage in this particular weight, some at as high as the 20% now because of their size. And what this does is it adds some students to their counts, and that represents extra costs for which is considered, when the allocation actually occurs. There are 36 other states that include a weight in their formula for small size. And the last year that we counted, we had about 47 systems of our 69 systems because, in level 1, we're only funding the 69 systems, and I'll explain a little more than that in a minute, but it's based on the 69 city impaired school systems, so 47 of our 69 city impaired school systems qualify for this weight, and that trend has increased over the years as the size of the systems has decreased. There are a couple of systems that Tensall right now at the latest count was just over 350 students, and the highest the school system that qualifies at the top of that range right now is St. Bernard at about 7,400 students. Those that do not participate range anywhere from Vernon, who has 7,600 students, to as great as Jefferson with the 48,000 students. So those would be the ones that don't participate in this particular weight. And what this did, once you apply that individual unique percent to each of the districts on what they qualify for, it adds about 13,000 students to the weighted count. And that means we've added 13,000 students times that base per pupil amount to the cost. So it is a way of appreciating that there's extra costs associated with these small systems. So this is the math. So what we do is we take that February 1 student count we talked about, we refer to as the base, and then we add on all of the weights, multiplying that, the student that's in the base times each of the weights that they qualify for, to come up with a total weighted student membership count. That count right now is about over 900,000 students, since we've added to what would be about 650-something thousand students in the base. And so once we get that membership, this is what it looks like in the spreadsheet. I thought y'all might like the math like we do here at the department. But this is what the spreadsheet looks like that actually calculates this. And so we have that base in the far left-hand column, and then we go and we count the economically disadvantaged, each of the weights, and at the end of the calculation is that total weighted membership count.
Beth,
Yes.
one student can be counted in different categories, such as economically disadvantaged or disabilities. So, I mean, one student can be like 3 or 4 or 5.
Right, a student can have several characteristics that qualify for these counts. They can only count once in the base, but then if they can certainly be economically disadvantaged and a student with disabilities. And that is all calculated. That's based on the data that we collect and analyze, and by the time we get it, it's all numbers that we add in by each one of the 69 city and parish school systems. So next, since we have that total weighted membership now we have to calculate that total cost.
I had a quick question.
Sure.
Could we get a copy of the 96 estimate for cost of minimum program of education? It said the last time the cost estimate was done for cost of education was 96. Could we get a copy of that work? I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm looking at this document. It was provided to me.
That's from Michael Falk.
Okay, so maybe Mr. Falk could share a copy, and then it's item 6 on his list, just helping us to appreciate, according to the text here, according to the Louisiana Constitution, Bessie shall annually adopt a formula which shall be used to determine the cost of a minimum program of education. The cost of a minimum program of education was last determined in 1996. So my request is to get a copy of that work.
We'll certainly look for that documentation, yes, sir.
Thank you.
And may I have a copy of Mr. Falk's information at some point as well? Thank you. Okay, so at this juncture, we have the total weighted membership, and then we have what we call the base per pupil amount. This is the per pupil amount, the dollar amount that Bessie has determined in agreement with the legislature that is the value to be applied to each one of the weighted students. So in order to do that, the last time the base per pupil amount was increased was in 1920, so it sits at $40.15 right now. And that is that particular philosophy is used in 32 other states across the country. So all we have to do is take the total weighted student membership count times the state and local base cost per pupil amount, which would be the $40.15, and that gives us the total MFP educational cost for our city and parish school systems. This is what it looks like on the spreadsheet. So we have that total level 1 cost. Now the next step is to share that cost between the state and the local school systems. So the local share of the cost is determined by looking at the potential for school systems to raise local revenue. We do this by collecting data from the school systems on their local taxes. This can be property or sales. There's a few other real estate revenues that we also collect and use a small portion of that to determine it. But it's basically what we've always referred to as the wealth calculation. It's really about potential at this point. It's not actual revenues, particularly on the ad valorem side, because on the ad valorem side, we're looking at net assessed taxable property. On the sales tax side, there is no comparable dollar amount reported. So we have to create a sales tax base. So the math there is you look at the sales tax revenue, so that is actual revenue collected, divided by the sales tax rate, and that becomes the potential on the sales tax side. Changes in either the net assessed taxable property or the sales tax base impacts that potential. So in years in which new assessments occur and the net assessed taxable property amounts go up, that could, depending on some other factors, that could make a school system appear a little more wealthy or a little more able to contribute to the cost of education in their school systems. The same is true for sales tax. Sales tax may go up and down dependent on the economy in a community. And so that also influences their wealth calculation or their potential to raise local revenue. But, you know, we recognized a very long time ago through the formula that spikes were hard to deal with. And so a school system should not be penalized when for some reason there is a spike above a certain level. And so Bessie and the legislature offered that there would be a 10% cap on spikes in net assessed taxable property. So that means that anything, if it occurs, anything over that 10% increase would not be counted in that first year that it occurs. And that kind of smooths, you know, the revenue that is reported to the department for the calculation. The second thing is that sales tax was capped at 15% spikes. So that, again, will help smooth out those increases and make that increase a little more palatable as we adjust the formula in that years. The second year, the remainder of that increase is recognized, and it does help the formula adjust, and if in fact it put them in a position to be so wealthy that the formula decreased their allocations because they are now able to contribute more on their local level, then it also, you know, helps them budget in a way that can smooth out that revenue to them, where they rely a little more heavily on their local revenues versus what the state is giving to them in the formula. So this is the table 7 where we actually collect all this data. You know, the net assessed taxable property and the sales tax, and we do verify this. There is an audit on the back end of this data to make sure that what's reported in their single audits matches this information. If for some reason their auditors went in during their annual single audit and did discover either a plus or minus in the revenues that were reported to us, we do make adjustments for that in the subsequent year to make sure that we're only counting the correct amount of revenues for each of the school systems. So then, so we have this potential, these numbers and the revenues. The way that the equity piece of the formula works is we then look across all of the school systems as to their millages and to their sales tax rates, and the formula calculates an average. And that average, that state amount, is where we start. And if, in fact, the distribution of the funds in a manner that is 65% for the state and 35% for the locals does not result in that calculation, like it could be a 67, 33 split or something like that, then the formula, the math, moves those amounts so that we always have a split, because that's what the resolution and everything guarantees, is that the split between that cost will always be at a 65-35% at the state level. Now, that doesn't mean that each individual school system's always going to be funded at 65-35. It is at a state level that we guarantee that split. On an individual level, the issue is that depends on their wealth. And so there are school systems who are very not wealthy. They are very poor, and the state puts up to 80, 85, 87% in that case of that cost that we calculated. The state may need to support them at that rate. But there are also some very fortunate school systems who have more local revenues or the potential to raise them, and they may only be funded at, say, 40, 48%. So it really depends on an individual situation, but this balance that we do in the math guarantees that it's always at 65-35 at the state level. And that's the piece that went to court and was determined to be an equitable distribution based on this math. And this is just the table where we make those calculations. You can see that in the third column, number 3, and in column number 6, is where we make those calculations about what millage and what sales tax rate are actually used to ensure that split. So the total share that we come up, because that calculation actually generates a local share so that we're fair on the local share, what is put up theoretically by the school systems based on the tax information that we get. We subtract that from the total cost of education, and then the state puts up the balance. And so, as I spoke, each school system is very unique. We do have a few school systems who over the year have been deemed to be so fortunate, to be so wealthy, that they really are not due much money from the formula, but a floor was put in to say that every school system, if you are fortunate enough to have local taxes that put you so small a percent that the state should provide you, you can always get at least 25%. And we have had a couple of school systems in that situation, Plaquemines being one of them, that has been in that situation for years. We also have, I think the latest statistics show that it's actually multiplied now to Cameron, Iberville, Red River, and Plaquemines, who are eligible for 25% from the state because they are fortunate to have local revenues that supply their portion, a larger portion of the cost than across some other school systems. Okay, I'll stop right there at level 1 in case y'all want to have any questions on level 1 before we move to level 2.
Any questions, anyone? All right.
Okay.
Carry on.
All right, level 2. Level 2, at the time that the formula was developed many years ago, and it was emphasized that, per the Constitution, it should be a shared responsibility between the state and the local school systems to support the education in Louisiana. There were systems who were not actually taxing themselves to a certain level, what was felt to be a minimum achievement in taxing themselves. And so this level 2 was implemented to be like a carrot to encourage school systems to support education in their communities. And so it acts as a reward. If they actually do raise taxes above a certain level, they are provided an extra allocation in level 2. So we also look here at actual property. We don't use net assess. We actually use actual property collections. We use sales tax collections, and then the other tax revenues, like I said, those small amounts from something like 16 section revenues. The amount of local revenues to determine this they have to exceed. So we measure their total revenues, and then we look at a cap, to determine like how much they each can get at this point. That overage amount, that excess, we'll call it, in the measurement, is capped at 34% of the school district's level 1 costs. We go back and look and see what their share of the level 1 cost, which is what we just spoke about, and we only look at a portion of that to set that cap. Any amount below that cap is eligible for the reward allocation. So the minimum, there has to be a minimum now. That was established as an amount, and that is that local share allocation in level 1. Right now, statistically, the school systems are all meeting that. They have been meeting it for a number of years, so they do participate in level 2. There are a few systems that are receiving the largest amount of level 2, depending on who they are, and there are a few now who have raised taxes in their communities to a level that they exceed the cap that we can supply them with. The cost of level 2 in perspective to level 1, which is about 2/3 or 66% of the $4 billion. Right now, level 2 is costing about $517 million, which is only 13% of the $4 billion that we actually give out in the formula. So as we measure their effort through the local tax revenues, that minimum is determined by taking the total local tax revenues minus their local share, as we talked about in level 1, and the result is that local revenue over the minimum. So that's the amount that's eligible for a reward. We've already talked about that cap on the reward. Usually when someone does participate in level 2, it's about 1/3. You get, depending on how much revenue you raise, it's about 1/3 you can estimate that you would be compensated as a reward for whatever amount you are increasing your taxes by. So we take the amount eligible to be considered in level 2, which is that maximum. We take that maximum, we minus their local revenue over, so here's that amount that's eligible, here's the maximum. We come up with the amount that's eligible for level 2. So we have a maximum level 2 amount, then you take out that local revenue over the minimum, and you come up with the amount that we can actually calculate the reward on. That local share percent to equal the level 2 local share is that amount eligible times a factor of 1.72. Now, the school finance expert, Dr. Augenblick, had come in and done a study to validate that relationship between level 1 and level 2 so that the proportion that was awarded in level 2 was in direct relation to level 1, and the math that he validated was this 1.72 factor. So we take that amount that's eligible for level 2 times the 1.72 times the level 1 local share percent, which is the percent that we have in level 1 that they actually contribute to that cost, and that's how we come up with the local share allocation in level 2, because again, it's a shared responsibility, so the school systems aren't given a whole amount that they're rewarded. They actually have a share that they have to put up theoretically. Then once we take that amount that's eligible for level 2, we subtract that local share allocation portion, we come up with what the state puts up in level 2. This is how it looks in the calculations themselves. You can see that in column 22, if you ever pull the spreadsheets, you can look at this level 2 allocation there. And just to give you a few statistics on level 2, the state allocation I mentioned was over $517 million, or 13%. There is a $1.278 billion to split at that point, $1 million to split at that point. So that is, the locals put up some of level 2 theoretically on paper, and then that's how we come to the $500 million that the state owes districts in level 2. And the cost of level 2, right now I did say was the 517 at about 13%. So it just kind of gives you perspective of how the money is divided amongst those 2 levels. With that, I'll stop for any questions.
Questions, comments? So, having heard through all 4 sections, I guess now may be a time of saying, what do you feel? Is there something that, I think the process is, if there's something that needs or wants to be changed by this committee, it would come through us to Bessie. Bessie would have to approve it. And then it would go to the legislature in order to be amended, correct? So, I open the floor. Is there anything you'd like to discuss now? Mr. Claxton?
All right. We know that coming up in March, we're dealing with amendments, UAL, we're talking about AG funds, tobacco funds. From Bessie, is there going to be any direction on what you may be submitting already? Because usually y'all submit the plan when we have the MFP committee, then we have the discussion and it's submitted. Has there been any?
I talked to Dr. Brumley yesterday. We have not put anything down on paper yet. So I would suspect probably soon, and obviously before, I think we have to go to the legislature in March with the MFP.
Right, the formula has to be adopted by Bessie at their March meeting because it has to be across the street by March the 15th.
Right,
Can I just offering up an idea?
okay?
Okay, so since the amendment for the UAL is set for March, so if we submit a plan and then it goes to legislation, they either shoot it down or not. And at that point, what happens if that amendment's failed? Do we have a plan in place for that? So to me, I would just recommend us coming up with something to put a 1.375, the 2,000, 1,000 in this, send it to legislation, then they have it just in case that amendment doesn't go through. If the amendment doesn't go through, they can send it back to Bessie. I'm just thinking of a contingency plan for us to make sure that the teachers and staff get their raises.
Understood. So we typically have what we're going to do, the recommendations from LDOE on the MFP in their January meeting, not necessarily with the January Bessie, which would be on the 9th and the 10th, but shortly thereafter, if we don't have something at that time. Is that correct?
We would normally come to Bessie in March with a plan.
I got you.
For the formula for Bessie to adopt. I will note that the election that Mr. Claxton is speaking of is not until March the 29th, but the Bessie will be required to submit some kind of formula by March the 15th. So we won't actually know the answer to any of that until after March the 29th.
Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
Yeah, but Bessie, I'm asking a question, but Bessie could, again, I'm asking a question, Bessie could submit an MFP proposal with a contingency, and that contingency would be dependent on the outcome of the election.
Well, Bessie could include provisions that would be an alternative solution should that amendment fail. We are not allowed to put a contingency in the resolution because it has the force and effect of law. But you could craft the formula as an alternative plan in case the amendment, you may have to come back and revisit it, have a second meeting later on, but.
But we could
yes.
put a provision in the
We could put-
MFP proposal depending on the outcome of the election.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
This committee, we're looking at dates like to meet again. We typically, as we did this year, this MFP committee would meet, go over the recommendations for the MFP that we're going to vote on in March. We typically we did it last year or this year in January. That's why I'm saying we may look at the afternoon like we're doing here of the 10th if the suggestion, MFP suggestion is available by then. If not, then this task force would need to come back at some point later on in January to review it. Yeah, we're going to try, I think, Beth, we're going to try it for the 10th. See if Dr. Brumley has something that he's suggesting, and then come before the board, this task force, and come away with something and go from there. And then bring it to Bessie in March. Go ahead.
I talked to Mr. Harris, and I'm just kind of curious, with the 8G money disappearing, are there any thoughts of how we would recommend or do, since we can't put it in the MFP because it funds our pre-K? I mentioned it to Ms. Ciano, and Mr. Harris had an idea at first, but I don't think it'll work. Any ideas of what we can do for that? To do the backfill they keep telling us?
Yeah, we discussed this during our committee yesterday to some degree, but not in a lot of detail. We did get some commitments at the table. They're on the record that they would try to backfill. I think that we're still kind of toying with ideas on strategy, but most likely we will be looking to the executive budget to get that money backfilled. Hopefully, it'll be in the governor's budget. If it's not, then it's a much harder fight in appropriations to get it added to. So, but we did have the governor commit, which you probably know more about that, and a lot of the key reformers committed to backfilling those dollars. So hopefully it'll get into the executive budget, and which will make it easier in ongoing years also, so that it just kind of built and baked into the budget. That's where we would like to approach it now. So we're looking at having meetings with the executive department about that. And then our executive director is submitting some information to the executive department for the budget.
It's great to have Representative Schlegel here, the head of the House Ed Committee, so thank you for being here today. Any, yes?
Hi, Amy LaFleur. I'm a representative from Evangeline Parish. I'm the CFO. I've been in that role for almost 24 years. So the MFP is a very crucial component for the school systems, as you all are very well aware. I will respectfully ask that you consider the support of the growth factor in order for our school systems to be able to appropriately budget and fund. A lot of the items that come across are restricted in nature. So that means that we are not able to use those funds freely. We only can use those funds to fund pre-K, to fund Perkins, all these other entitlements, federal dollars. Some of our own local revenues are very restricted in nature. All of our ad valorem taxes in my parish, I'm one of the few parishes that has an athletic ad valorem tax in a very small community. Those funds cannot be used for other things. Whereas our MFP and the growth factor enables us to better budget. We've experienced, I'm a very rural district, as Ms. Beth talked about. I'm below the 7,500, way below. Property insurance alone for us went up 350-something thousand in 1 year to well over $1 million. And I can't even imagine in a large district. So that's just an example of one item that's fixed. We have to have property insurance. Should we have a hurricane, then we're wiped out. We don't, our coffers are not full, although ours are better than a lot of others. We have experienced a deficit the last year. We probably are slated to experience another one this year, even though we are very fiscally responsible in the fact that we do staffing formulas. We account for our special education via staffing formulas. We go down to tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 instruction, all of those things. But in order for us to be fiscally responsible, we still have to have funds available to us that are free in nature as far as they can only be used for whatever educational purposes, but not restricted to you can only buy this with it or you can only do that with it. And so I just ask your consideration. Like I said, I'm a 24-year veteran of public education, wouldn't do anything different, and I appreciate all the work that goes into the MFP formula, and we verify and check all of our numbers, based upon our audit. We've never had a problem with that. I don't mind sharing our books with anybody. So.
Thank you. Ms. Champagne.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And that was a great point, which she brought up. And I will have some questions to to LDOE as well as some of the districts. And some of it was about properties. We do have some districts right now that I'm aware of across the state that are actually looking at their properties and how they're being utilized. and if they can be utilized in a different manner to kind of take away that liability they're having on insurance costs. So not all districts are the same, we understand that, but I will have an entire list, so I hope the districts are very receptive to my questions that y'all will be getting to help us determine the best way to benefit the districts in helping with their budgets. So I will have that list coming pretty soon. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Anyone else? So moving on then, we do have one public comment card. Mr. Michael Falk, Louisiana Association of School Superintendents, wishes to speak. Mr. Falk. This handout, by the way, this MFP
Yes,
recommendation.
I did a
that's-
handout,
That's from Mr.
and
Falk.
Beth and I both started working with this new formula in 1992. And I'm going to say this is a jewel of a person to work with. She really is. I bothered her so much, and I still bother her because I get questions from school systems. So what I did is I put together a set of recommendations from the Superintendent's Association. The first point I want to make is that the last 20 years, the base per pupil has increased by $556. I have a chart at the back of my thing that goes year by year that shows where the MFP was changed and by how much. Then I also have a chart that shows if the 2.75% had been placed on the per pupil amount since 2009, which was the last, they had two previous increases, but if you did 2.75, today the level 1 per pupil amount would be $5,933. Then I think districts would have a hard time coming before you year after year talking about the things that we're experiencing. And I did place some of those things in my notes. Beginning in 2010, we've had a lot of reform to education. We've had a lot of changes to education. And it's hard for me to imagine, Mr. Morris, the reason I put 1996, because that was the last time it was calculated. It was during Governor Foster's administration, because he committed to fully funding the formula over a 4-year period, and that happened in 1996. There are things that have happened since that time. And school systems, as the financial officer related, we face rising costs in operating the systems and providing services. Everybody talks about the ESSER funds. The ESSER funds will cease to exist at the end of this year. We have been able to do some good things with ESSER funds through the department, with their grants, through allocations. We were one of the few states that made significant gains in learning loss because we were able to funnel resources into areas that we knew would work with children. Healthcare. Healthcare costs are increasing to districts. Inflationary costs. School safety. Property insurance. Some districts experience 300% increase in their property insurance. Professional development associated with changes in accountability, changes in the standards, implementation of new standards. The requirements of technology capacity. School districts were able to add a lot regarding technology with ESSER funds. Those technology instruments now will no longer be up to date. We did a lot of professional development with instruction virtually. We're still doing virtual instruction, but we're going to have to replace those instruments. So we would like to support a 1.375% increase in the base per pupil. And Beth is right. You have the poorest district gets 88% of 4,015. I've tried to tell districts over the years, you're not getting the full 4,015. This is a shared responsibility between state and local. We've now done locally, raised local revenues to the point that now public education in Louisiana is being funded 50% by the state and 50% by the locals. And I have the statistics to show, and they're all based on the budget letters that the department sends out, and I'm going to be sharing that with the members as we move forward. I just think it's time, and the MFP resolution, the dollar amounts are based on what you put in the resolution. So you have to watch the wording in the resolution, because changing one word from shall to may or may to shall can impact the entire MFP. And I want to commend this Bessie board for doing what they're doing with this MFP, because I've been here many years, 34 to be exact, coming before Bessie, advocating for the MFP. And what has transpired over the years is you have a meeting in December, the task force makes a recommendation, the meeting is over in an hour, they go to the Bessie meeting in January, 30 minutes for public comments, and boom, it's done. And you are looking at 40% of the state's general fund budget. 40%, right here, MFP. State general fund does not include the federal funds and all. It's time that it be given due diligence. It's time that it be elevated to today's day of providing a minimum program of education for our children across the state. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Falk. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Mr. Falk, thank you for your testimony and your passion for this item.
Well, you know, MFP stands for Mike Falk's problem. Did you know that?
Appreciate that. So, first question, the 2.75, what's the basis for that number?
The basis of that, when we started the formula, used to special ed and transportation services were provided dollar for dollar. Well, the costs were astronomical and growing. So the legislature at that time, the guy from Lafayette, Jerry, you remember him, Mr. Harris and Ms. Champagne, said, wait, we can't handle these costs, so let's build in a factor, a yearly factor for cost increase that we can put in the formula to help manage this. So 2.75 was determined. And
So it takes into account what?
to take increasing costs, and they took special ed, and they took transportation out of the line item of calculations, and I think also K-3 reading. And they just put it in the cost calculation for the minimum program. And that was absorbed into that. And then every year after that, they were going to look at increasing the base per pupil by 2.75 to do the cost.
Okay, so basically it was an inflationary adjustment.
Yes.
You take out your high dollar items, and these are the minimum costs to run the school system. Okay, and then the 1.375, that's just a compromise, 50% of the 2.75?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and then
But we also recommend that the 2,000 and 1,000 stipend become a permanent part of the formula so they can be funded every year.
Got it. And then I'm going back again to the estimate from 96. Can you just briefly give us a little history? Do you have the history on that? How that was conducted, who was conducted by, what was involved in that process?
The State Department receives the annual financial reports from districts every year with all the budget codes. The only thing that we were asking is those same budget codes that were used in 96 from the AFR are used to calculate. You get the information from all of the districts based on the AFR that they submit, and those codes are used to determine the actual cost of providing a minimum program of education. You also have the 70% requirement that it must go through to instruction.
And can you just ballpark me, how big a task is that?
Well-
Is that a 6-month exercise, or is that 2 weeks, or?
Can I just say that, so in the early days, when the cost was estimated, we had us hired, and the state appropriated money for a school finance expert to come in, because there are methodologies to determine cost. We have not, always looked at just what the school systems spend, because that's how the old formula worked. And so it was just simply driven by expenditures. It may not necessarily be a cost, either plus or minus the expenditures. So the school finance experts came in and did what they call a cost study. Like, here's what we, after surveying, it's probably spent a year on gathering lots of data, because they're looking at what should things cost and what product is produced. It's a very extensive research project that if we ever did it again, we would need to hire, some other experts to do, because just looking at what they spend, we do get their financial data and we know what they spend, but is that really true to cost? Because everybody's is different in their communities. It is a way of analyzing, what the cost is in each community, but again, their economies are different. So really, the school finance expert is the one who went and looked at all the data. There was some analysis, like Mike says, done about what was spent, but there is several different, theoretical methodologies used by these experts to come in and determine these costs, and it's really based on what is valued in that state as regarding to education.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is a 1-year exercise, and it's going to require an independent contractor.
Yes.
So there's a fiscal note associated with that.
Yes.
Okay, the last question, is there a standard across the country? How often do other states take another look at it? Do you know?
I would say it just depends. Each one of the 50 states is probably in a little bit different location. Obviously this is in partnership with their legislatures and the available money that a state has in order to do this. I think most of them every 5 years, might look at some component of the formula. Some who have not had any issues with theirs may wait longer. So it really is a unique, although we all, we are in line with structurally with a lot of the states across the country. Everybody's financial situation is a little bit different.
Right, but once every 29 years, something about that just doesn't feel right to me. No comment on that one? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Anyone? So let me just take the opportunity to, once again, echo what Mr. Falk said about Ms. Shiono. Thank you so much for doing this. And having this committee together at the behest of Ms. Champagne, whenever we first took office, to go through these 4 sections and just to learn some more about it, and there's any things that we can do. So I appreciate the committee taking time to come to these 3 meetings, and I'm hoping that what will come out of this is something that we can go forward with that is going to be of greater benefit to the kids than it is now. So we will get with all of you when we will meet next. I'm hoping it's the afternoon of our next BESI meeting, like we have it now. It may not be if the MFP suggestions are not available by that time, but we will let you know. Given that, nothing else, so we are adjourned. Thank you very much.